So the passage we've looked at today is a letter to Hebrew people. And that means it's Jewish people who have accepted Jesus Christ as God's Son and who believe that he died and rose again, so Jewish Christians. Now this group of people apparently were tempted to turn away from this belief. And maybe it's because their families maybe have even disowned them at this point for following Jesus and turning away from the Jewish faith. The writer of this letter is unknown. Another thing to know about is this mysterious character who is mentioned in both the Psalm and Hebrews, Melchizedek. He was called the King of Peace and Priest of God. In those times, there were rules about who could be priest. In particular, they all had to come from the Levi tribe, in that family line. So when God's people left Egypt after being in slavery, they were all split into 12 tribes, each with their own leader. But the Levi tribe was kind of set aside to do the priestly duties, so they didn't have to fight in wars and things like that. They did the priestly duties. And unlike other priests in the Old Testament, Melchizedek was not a descendant of that tribe. And this is important because neither was Jesus. Both Melchizedek and Jesus was not priests by regulation. They did not fit the criteria of God's priests according to the law. The Old Testament priesthood would have needed to be from that family line. Also, Melchizedek has no recorded father or mother, nor record of birth or death. He appears to have no beginning or end, so can be seen to remain a priest forever. The writer of Hebrews also knows that Abraham himself is blessed by Melchizedek, indicating the priest's importance and superiority. As it says in verse 7, the lesser is blessed by the greater. What does it mean that Jesus is our permanent king priest, though? That question led my thinking to about our own leaders, and about rules and laws that are made, especially at the moment we've just had a new government and all that kind of thing. Because we know we have rules and laws in most parts of our lives, and they are made really to stop people from doing wrong things, to help with fairness and to keep order. We may not always agree with the rules presented to us. We may argue about the rules of monopoly or the rules of gender, as me and Roger were arguing about the other day at Scouts.
That was right.
Yeah, you were right. We did actually get that proven. Or we may disagree with the laws in Parliament even. We might be suspicious of the agenda behind some of the rules. Some rules and laws we may feel actually create inequality or protect one group of people, leaving another group vulnerable. If we think back to the beginning when Adam and Eve made that decision to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, after God had told them not to, and that if they did they would die. So in the beginning that's what happened, isn't it? But I always think, well, why would God not want them to have this knowledge? The way I see it is, by eating that fruit, it's not that they have knowledge of good and evil, it's that they then make those decisions of what's good and evil, rather than following God's guide. In our society, someone, a human, decides what is right and wrong. The MPs debate and decide what is classed as criminal and what is not. Others, like judges, juries and magistrates, decide who will be punished and who won't. Then we have people in the media who also seem to decide what's right and what's wrong, who to demonise and who deserves mercy. Social media often appears to support people making decisions about who's in or out, when we think about the cancel culture that we have now. What looks beautiful and what doesn't. The problem here is that the humans that make these decisions are far from perfect. Our bosses, MPs, judges, priests, journalists, whoever is leading or making decisions is only human, as we are. They get ill, they are very prone to sin, selfish at times, and often have their own agenda, their own fears and weaknesses. They let us down, and they are weak because of all these. To add to this, human leaders are never permanent. The people in charge will change sooner or later. Some will be around for a short time, some for longer, but none forever. And I know this is sounding rather doom and gloom, that it's a bit depressing and that there's no one that we can really rely on, but that's not what it means. It means that, because as we know, there are many, many, many human beings who, despite their own flaws and despite living in this fallen world, do wonderful things. They show kindness and are generous, they stick up for the less powerful, they work hard for their families, give money and time to people in need, and lots of other things that we can think of. And yes, they are still there's still all those things that we listed that aren't very good, but ultimately none of those things matter because they do what they can anyway. We can still always see glimpses of love of God. There's more going on, and I always think there's more going on that's good than bad. I know we often hear a lot of the bad stuff in the news, but there's a lot of good going on, probably more than the bad. Back before Jesus came, there were laws in place too. Rules to stop people from doing things that God didn't want his people to do. One of those things that was required was making sacrifices for sins. When someone did wrong, they needed to atone through, usually, the blood of an animal. Ultimately, these laws didn't work out though, because as we know, time and time again, people failed. Before the laws was made, it was difficult to approach God and to have a direct relationship with him as well. The law then could not make people perfect as it doesn't today, and there was something and is something lacking. Maybe because all people ultimately are highly prone to sin in this fallen world. So a new priesthood is needed, a new law, a new way. Laws and regulations can be helpful, but they can also be a barrier. If people are shamed, they don't usually change. It's something I really always feel quite passionate about. I feel quite upset when I see people carrying a lot of guilt and shame. It really does destroy people. I've often watched that programme, I don't know if anyone else watches it, Long Lost Family. Yeah, one of the big things in that is obviously people in the programme tend to have given up children because they had to. For whatever reason, they had no choice or they were actually forced to. And something that strikes me every single time is the guilt and shame that those people have carried all their life. You know, just feeling so awful about it. And the guilt and shame is such a barrier. And it's awful because it says in John, Jesus did not come to condemn, but to save. And if people are always made to feel not good enough, then that's who they think they are. Often when people feel shame, it's because somebody has made them feel that way. That they feel it themselves, but they've not been told differently, and they've not been given that opportunity to let that go. They will not be able to live their life to the full with that burden permanently on their shoulder. There'll always be consequences for sin, but without reconciliation and forgiveness after, people will often continue with their sin, which is no good for anybody. The letter to the Hebrews declares that the new priest king spoken about in the Old Testament is Jesus. And as the psalm predicted, a new king of Jerusalem was coming, who will reign forever. A new priest, like Melchizedek, and a new promise that says the king's enemies will become insignificant. They will become a footstool. Jesus is all we need. His way is perfect, and he came to earth as a human to show us his better way and to show us his character. Jesus has walked in our footsteps. He was tried and tested and was not compromised by sin. And this means that there was no need for him to make sacrifices every day like the others would have had to. He died for our sin, so we don't have to be destroyed by our guilt and shame. We can give it to God and try again. Even now, he's always at work, eternally. He won't have to retire or step down. He won't die. He won't get a new job. He's there forever. His ministry replaced the Old Testament laws about approaching God too. The barriers are torn down through him, and sin was dealt with in ways the old law couldn't when he died for us. Jesus brought better access, blessings, and gave all who believed hope. And his authority comes from our Father in heaven, the creator of heaven and earth. So we know we can trust what he says, what he teaches and what he asks us to do. All must bow to him. The prophets, Aaron, Moses, Melchizedek, Abraham and the angels and so on. This priest will not need replacing. Jesus rose again. He is permanent, he's forever. Recently I read the book of Exodus and I was thinking when I was reading it how difficult it was for the Israelites as they after they escaped the slavery. They were in the wilderness, they struggled for food, they had no fruit, no hope, they felt alone and even considered that they'd be better off back in Egypt as slaves. But as I went on to read the first chapter of Deuteronomy, and I can never say that word, so sorry, it read differently. Speaking of those same circumstances, but this time the focus was different. In the wilderness, God was there. He did provide, he protected. And it's something they didn't see all the time, they didn't notice it all the time, but he was there. And in this world, we will have trouble, we will suffer. There are wars everywhere and suffering and pain. There are human leaders who we feel we just can't trust. But Jesus' rule goes beyond all of that and is in the middle of the battle. We have a leader who won't let us down and who has a plan for each and every one of us. So even though things may seem bleak, we must do what we can anyway to love and serve God and each other, striving to copy his character. Even with all this uncertainty or feeling scared, we have a permanent priest king to look to. We can speak to him whenever we want now, and we can learn who he is, who God is when we read our Bible. God's peace and joy can be experienced amid suffering if we persevere in faith. So let us remember, as Jesus said, here on earth you will have trials, many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world.